Hi, it's Mrs. Huffcutt, and I've got another chapter of Miss Hickory by Carolyn Sherwin Bailey, and we were moving towards the end of this book. Chapter 13, Homeless Again. Robin was a conceited, pompous fellow. One reason for this was his family nickname, Robin Redbreast, quite undeserved because his waistcoat was not red but a rusty orange. Another reason for Robin's vanity was the attention he always received when he arrived north in early April. "The first robin" and "the early bird catches the worm" were among the sayings that greeted him if he got home first, which he always tried to do. So Robin strutted over the grass of the old place, cocking his ear toward the ground to catch the sound of wriggling, dipping in, bringing up a worm, and downing it whole, although he much preferred cherries. He was really showing off because he loved the notice he attracted. He knew that his name would be printed in the newspaper among the other arrivals from the south. And this is a picture of him eating that worm. He did not need his annual trip south, as he had excellent health and strong lungs. One of his cousins frequently stayed north in the deep pine woods all winter, but not Robin. Running the risk of being made into a pie, off he flew south every autumn and back in the spring just to satisfy his stomach and his pride. And now, as spring well started, he had returned, shivering, but determined to keep up his early bird reputation. He knew that the tree in which he had nested the year before was also remembered sentimentally, so he made a practice going back to it before his maid insisted that he stop behaving like a clown and begin building. On this day in particular, now in April, a flock of early bluebirds had claimed more compliments than Robin, and he flew over to the orchard along Mackintosh Lane until he found the gnarled old apple tree with its bent and sheltering boughs where his nest had rested so safely last summer. There it was, still resting tight and strong in the crotch of the boughs. But as Robin alighted on the rim of his old nest, he had a great surprise. When Miss Hickory cleaned house, she did it thoroughly. The first April showers had softened the mud with which her nest had been plastered, so she patted and smoothed it. She had laid long strips of smooth bark across protruding twigs of the nest for shelves, and she brushed off these shelves and rearranged what berries and rose hips were left from her winter's store of frozen foods. She threw away her old bedding of leaves and down and replaced it with the soft curling buds of the new ferns that were coming up along the banks of the three brooks. As a last touch, she shaped a little bowl of clay, and when a shower had filled it, she put in a bunch of very early Mayflowers in it to make her next nest bloom with the spring. As she was in the midst of this house cleaning, Crow flew over and stopped by. "Good work," Crow cawed, peering inside. "I have warned all my pals against trespassing here. Is there anything I can do for you?" "Not a thing, thank you, unless you can advise me about my spring wardrobe." Miss Hickory looked coquettish, then scowled in disapproval at Crow's untidy suit. He dropped his head in shame. I plan to take a bath next month," he said. He turned to fly, but Miss Hickory called, "When does school open, Crow? I may apply for the job of teacher. I taught Hen Pheasant how to quilt." "Open?" Crow jeered. "It will close in 2 moons now. School's been keeping all winter when I was away. The time for playing has come, longer days and sunny weather." "Then I must make myself a play suit," she said, but to herself, for Crow was off again. Miss Hickory was very much in need of new clothes. Her head was dangerously bare since she'd lost her hat. Her dress was in shreds, and there were holes in her coat. She set off immediately for stuffs, and although the old pine needles were brittle and the new ones bent as she sewed and knitted, she did contrive to outfit herself very well. There were enough new leaves to stitch into a short skirt and new green grass for knitting herself a sweater. Although very little hat material was to be found, she shaped a large bonnet of wild cherry blossoms. And there's a preview of her fashion. Her hands, limber and quick, flew. As a finishing touch, she slipped her hard little feet into a pair of pink lady slippers. "They will wear out quickly," she thought, "but I will carry them when I take a long walk. Jack in the pulpit will be holding Sunday services soon. His green hands are just showing through the ground in the swamp. He will admire me in pink slippers." So the days went by, and Miss Hickory did not go home to Mackintosh Lane for a week. Checkerberry leaves, tender and spicy, made her meals, and an old acorn cup held clear brook water when she was thirsty. Her legs that showed to the knees below her short play skirt seemed more shapely, brown, and plumper than last spring. "I believe I am growing," she thought. "Anyway, I am much more limber." Indeed, Miss Hickory looked sprightly and smart as she started home. Her lady slippers hung by a length of grass around her neck to save them. All the way there were signs of an early spring, red maples in full bloom, willows turning yellow, young lambs frisking in acre peace, a greening light on Temple Mountain. As she came to her tree and swung by a low branch to the one next higher, as she started climbing up boughs, she felt extraordinarily happy. She thought how much nicer a nest was than her corncob house that had broken up in a severe ice storm last winter. Even if it had lasted another season, she decided, she would not have returned to it. Climbing, thinking, feeling contented, she did not see until she was right beside it that her nest was occupied. A bunchy ball of feathers with a sharply beaked head set inside. Robin, whose wife it was sitting there on eggs, perched as a guard on a branch close by, looking ridiculous, with a long worm hanging out of his mouth. And there's a picture of the birds and Miss Hickory. In that instant, that Miss Hickory's shock made her dumb, Robin dropped his worm. He swelled out his waistcoat, opened his bill fiercely, and flew at her. She swung to another limb, broke off a twig, and shook it at him. Get out! What do you mean by taking my nest? Go away, both of you! Your nest? Who gathered the twigs and brought the mud a mouthful at a time? Who made it strong enough to last all winter? Who stole it and lived in it? Arguments Miss Hickory knew that she could not answer. I cleaned it for the spring, she said in a low voice. And paid no rent, Robin scolded. Do you know the proper name for a person like you who settles into an empty nest that he did not build? Cowbird. That sounded shameful to Miss Hickory, if true, but she was grief-stricken. All seemed lost. Her view of Temple Mountain, the stars at night, the forest by day, her apple tree housekeeping, most of all, her safety. She tried again. I thought that birds always built new nests in the spring. So they do, but when I find an old nest in as good shape as this one, I move in. We have a head start now in eggs. The children will be hatched and down before those of any other bird for miles around. News that! We shall get another newspaper notice. Still Miss Hickory lingered. Then if I stay around, if I wait, I could perhaps have the nest later, she ventured. Robin went into a rage. He flew at her, pecking. No, go away. I may raise a second family. Don't dare to come up this tree again. Miss Hickory went down boughs in haste, losing her bonnet on the way. This was the first time in her whole life that she had felt really hopeless. Crow was too rugged a man to come to her rescue a second time. He would feel, she knew, that she should, after such a good winter, be able to settle her own affairs. Chipmunk would live untidily all summer in the ruins of the corncob house. Mr. T. Willard Brown was too busy in the barn to help her, and also he was a selfish person. Far above her in the apple tree, Miss Hickory could hear Robin in a burst of song, fairly gloating over her. Cheer up, cheerio, early bird, cheer up, he sang. Miss Hickory reached the earth and looked about on all sides. Everything was spring light. Violets bloomed in purple delight. The dandelions were golden pennies spread as far as she could see. Yet here she was, her new bonnet lost, and her beautiful pair of pink lady slippers far above her where she had lost them too in her hurry of coming down boughs. Suddenly she had a plan. For the last moon she had not heard Squirrel scampering about cracking nuts down here in his hole at the roots of her tree. Very likely, she decided, Squirrel had moved. His hole would be a pleasant home for her, cool in summer and cozy next winter. Miss Hickory peered into the darkness of the hole, listened, then stepped inside. And that's the end of the chapter. Thank you for listening.